Before we dive into what went down, it's important to understand the backstory between Jack and Laura Turner. About 6 years ago, Laura started pulling away from the family, both emotionally and physically. It wasn't just out of the blue. She was getting sucked into her social scene, spending more time caught up in the neighborhood gossip and the petty distractions that came with it. Bit by bit, she drifted further from Jack and the kids. The more she hung out with her so-called friends, Ellen, Julia, and Susan, the more she put a wedge between herself and her husband, even though Jack, despite his constant business trips, stayed devoted to his family. The growing distance between them fed into suspicion, misunderstandings, the kind of stuff that eventually leads to betrayal. During this time, Laura started acting more unpredictable. She slacked off on her family duties, leaving Jack to pick up the slack at home while she got lost in the world of gossip and other personal distractions. The more she pulled away emotionally, the more Jack, ever the family man, took on the weight of it all. Over time, the gap between them grew wider, and with her friends whispering nonsense in her ear, Laura convinced herself that Jack must have been having an affair. That misguided belief sent her spiraling into her own infidelity. Jack was miserable, and it showed. As he shuffled through the customs checkpoint, looking worn and ragged, the officers barely gave him a second glance. Later on, they'd be criticized for not alerting health authorities given how sick he obviously looked. "Where is she?" Jack muttered under his breath, anger building. Laura wasn't answering her phone even though she knew exactly when he was landing. Frustrated, he thought about calling his daughter, Diane, to come get him, though he hated the idea of making her deal with the airport traffic. When Diane answered, Jack told her he was feeling awful and needed a ride. She quickly assured him it was no problem, telling him her brother Eric was with her, and they'd be there in about half an hour. Jack felt a mix of gratitude and irritation. He had always warned Diane about the mess of airport traffic, but right now, he was just thankful she was used to navigating it. Diane and Eric had been out shopping for Jack's birthday present when they got the call. Jack had always put his family first, often going without for himself. He drove around in an old beat-up minivan while Laura and Diane had newer cars. As soon as Diane told Eric what was going on, he picked up on the urgency. "Dad's sick at the airport. We need to get going," she said. "I heard Mom talking last night. She knew exactly when his flight was getting in," Eric growled. Diane, annoyed, added, "I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail." Typical Laura, ignoring her phone like it didn't matter. The family had gotten used to it, but it still got under their skin. Half an hour later, they arrived at the airport. Ever considerate, Jack had been waiting outside despite how bad he felt. Diane and Eric rushed over to him, but Jack looked out of it, sitting on a bench, shivering. "Dad!" Eric shouted, panic rising in his voice. "Oh, you got here so fast." "It's only been 5 minutes," Jack mumbled, clearly confused. Diane helped him to the car while Eric grabbed the bags. Despite cranking up the heat in the car, Jack kept shivering. Eric, feeling his dad's burning forehead, suggested they take him to the hospital, but Jack, stubborn as ever, insisted he just wanted to go home, completely unaware of how bad things had gotten. 40 minutes later, they pulled into the driveway. Diane helped her dad out of the car while Eric hauled the luggage. Standing by the front door, looking a bit too comfortable, was their neighbor Susan, holding a store-bought coffee cake like nothing was wrong. "Oh, hey, Shimp," Jack said, using the nickname he had for his wife's friends, clearly trying to mask his discomfort. Diane had to bite back a grin. Susan, looking puzzled, asked, "What's going on? Why is your dad home?" "We had to pick him up from the airport. Mom forgot, and he's really sick," Diane said with a sharp edge to her voice. Susan, still holding the door open, glanced inside where they could hear Laura laughing and chatting with Ellen. As Diane guided Jack into a chair, she turned to her mother, fuming with anger. "Dad called us because you forgot to get him." Now I see why. You were too busy with Ellen's brother, she snapped. Laura, clearly embarrassed, looked down, avoiding eye contact, while Eric brought in the luggage. Still furious, Diane told Eric to grab a thermometer. Once he left, Diane wrapped her arms around Jack. Dad, what do you think about infidelity? She asked, throwing a pointed glare at her mother. Jack, dazed and not fully aware of what was happening, replied, infidelity. It's a terrible betrayal. It hurts everyone, especially the kids. Can it ever be forgiven? Diane pressed, her eyes narrowing on Laura. Unaware of the full situation, Jack answered, not in my case. I could never forgive it. Just then, one of Laura's so-called friends, Julia, made some tasteless joke about Viagra, which Jack brushed off, adding, that stuff just gives me headaches. The women were stunned by his bluntness, while Eric, overhearing, thought it was way more than anyone needed to know. Suddenly, Ellen's phone rang. What? That can't be. Jack's right here, she said, glancing nervously at Laura, who had gone pale, clearly rattled. Before anyone could react further, Eric yelled from across the room, Diane. Dad's temperature is almost 104. Panic set in as Diane quickly dialed emergency services. While waiting for the ambulance, they wrapped cold towels around Jack, trying to bring his fever down despite his protests. Somehow, they managed to keep him cool enough until help arrived. Diane rode with Jack in the ambulance, shooting a look at her mother that dared her to say something, anything. At the hospital, after what felt like an eternity of tests, the doctors finally diagnosed Jack with a severe bacterial infection. They started him on antibiotics right away but warned that there could be lasting damage to his brain, heart, and other organs. As Diane and Eric sat in the hospital, praying for their father's recovery, Laura sat nearby, trembling. Diane would glance at her mother now and then, eyes filled with resentment, her mind flooded with bitterness over how the last 6 years had played out. Laura had been an absent wife and mother, more interested in gossip and her own distractions than her family. Meanwhile, Jack had shouldered the burden quietly, with Diane stepping up to help however she could. The last 2 years had been especially brutal for Diane. With Jack traveling constantly for his job, after his last company went under, he'd hated being away so much, but it was the only way to make ends meet. The sacrifices they made were because of Laura's refusal to move when Jack was offered better jobs that required relocating. Even now, as Diane glared at her mother, she couldn't help but think bitterly that Laura's stubbornness had kept Jack away from home for so long. Diane understood now, though. She knew why her mother stayed behind during those late evenings with her friends. Her anger boiled as she thought about her younger sister, Amy, who was spending the weekend at their cousin's house as a reward for her good grades. Diane wasn't sure if they should tell Amy about Jack being in the hospital, possibly on the verge of dying. The weekend was supposed to be a celebration for Amy, but Diane knew Amy would never forgive them if she missed the chance to say goodbye to their dad. Jack was officially admitted to the hospital, and Dr. Peterson came in with a somber update. Jack had an antibiotic-resistant bacterial infection. Though they'd managed to bring his temperature down, the next 24 to 48 hours would be critical. There was still a possibility of permanent damage, but Dr. Peterson said that with some luck, Jack might recover. He asked about Jack's recent travel history, and Diane explained that he had just gotten back from a business trip to Brazil. The doctor nodded gravely, mentioning that he would need to contact both the CDC and Brazilian authorities to inform them. Though visitors were allowed, he warned them that they would need to wear masks and gloves, and keep their visits short. Jack was restless and delirious, likely from the high fever. Diane mentioned that her dad had always struggled with horrible nightmares whenever he was sick and asked if there was anything they could do to help calm him down. Dr. Peterson suggested something simple. Holding his hand might help soothe him, but he stressed the importance of following all the safety precautions, like changing masks and gloves between visits. After thanking the doctor, Diane decided she would stay by her father's side for as long as he needed her. She told Eric to come back in a few hours to relieve her, then turned to her mother, barely looking at her, and said with a cold detachment, "Do whatever you want." Diane's focus was solely on her father now. Her mother had become nothing more than a background figure in her life. Donning a mask and gloves, Diane stepped into Jack's hospital room. The sight of her father, loosely restrained to keep him from thrashing, broke her heart. She sat beside him, gently took his hand, and whispered, "Dad, it's me, Diane. I'm here. Everything's going to be all right," though her voice trembled with emotion. Jack, weak and confused, muttered something about whether she'd finished her homework, clearly mixing the present with some distant memory. Diane chuckled softly, playing along. "Yeah, Dad, I did. Everything's just fine. You get some rest now." As Jack relaxed, she heard the door creak open. Expecting Eric, Diane was surprised to see her mother step into the room. Laura walked over quietly and took Jack's other hand, her face painted with sorrow. Diane, however, doubted the sincerity of it. To her, it was just another act in her mother's long-running show. Resentment surged through her, but she held it in for the sake of her father, not wanting to upset him. Soon, Eric appeared at her side, tears streaming down his face. "I love you, Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Turning to Diane, Eric said, "Ellen's driving us home. I'll be back in about 7 hours." Then he looked at Laura. "You coming?" Without a word, Laura bowed her head and followed Eric out, leaving Diane alone with her father again. For over an hour, Diane sat by Jack's side, offering comfort whenever he stirred or grew restless. But eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and she needed a break. After carefully removing her mask and gloves, she stepped out of the room. In the hallway, she noticed her mother sitting there, looking pale and distressed, with Susan by her side trying to console her. Diane couldn't resist making a snide comment as she walked past, something about how her father was still sound asleep, which drew a concerned look from Susan. Taking a moment to clear her head, Diane slipped into the bathroom and dialed her best friend, Emily, who immediately offered to help in any way she could. After that, Diane called her father's best friend, Tom, but instead reached his partner, Adam. Breaking down, Diane explained Jack's critical condition. Adam reassured her that he would be there as quickly as possible, even though Tom was currently out of the country. Adam wasted no time. He grabbed the checkbook and the emergency credit card, which had a $100,000 limit, determined to do whatever it took to help Jack. He sped to the hospital and, upon arriving, found Laura sitting outside Jack's room with a woman he didn't recognize. Laura looked utterly distraught, tears streaking her face. "Laura, how are you? Is that Jack's room?" Adam asked, his tone filled with concern. Laura, overwhelmed with grief, simply nodded. "Yes, Diane's inside." "I'm here for you, Laura," Adam said softly, offering comfort, though Laura's expression only darkened further. Feeling uneasy, Adam turned to introduce himself to the other woman sitting with Laura. "I'm Susan, a neighbor," she said, offering a polite smile. Adam sensed something was off but chose not to press. Instead, he thanked her for supporting Laura and, after a reminder from Susan to wear a mask and gloves, headed into Jack's hospital room. Diane, who had dozed off in the chair beside her father, stirred as Adam entered. The relief on her face was immediate. "Uncle Adam," she whispered, her voice soft, "Dad stable. I'm so glad you're here." Adam knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "What's going on, Diane?" he asked gently. With a heavy sigh, Diane shared everything, from the moment Jack called her from the airport to her growing certainty that her mother, Laura, had been unfaithful for years. Adam listened in shock, trying to process what he was hearing. "Are you sure, Diane?" he asked cautiously, hoping for some alternative explanation. "Maybe there's something else going on." But Diane was resolute. She described her mother's erratic behavior over the years, how she'd pulled away from the family, her increasing obsession with her friends, and the late nights she spent out. I've basically accused her of infidelity, and you know what? She never even denied it, Diane finished bitterly. Adam stayed by Diane's side for the next 2 hours, feeling more troubled by the situation with each passing minute. He had promised Jack that he would keep an eye on the family while he was sick, but this was far beyond what he'd anticipated. As much as he hated the idea, Adam knew he would have to tell Tom about everything when he got back. If things spiraled further out of control, he would have no choice but to break his promise to Jack. Eventually, Adam excused himself, needing some air. Outside, Laura and Susan were still sitting in the hallway. Watching them, Adam was reminded of the wisdom and kindness of Tom's late mother, Lily, and how she would have handled a situation like this. Compelled to act in her spirit, he knelt down in front of Laura and gently took her hands. "Laura," he said softly, "what's going on?" Laura's eyes went wide with panic. She opened her mouth to speak but couldn't find the words. Adam, frustrated by her silence, stood up and blurted out, "Lily would have kicked your behind for this." That broke the dam. Laura collapsed into Susan's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The following day, Diane, Eric, and Adam sat down together to discuss their suspicions about Laura. Eric, always tech-savvy, came up with a plan to secretly monitor their mother's activities. He set up hidden cameras and microphones around the house and even placed a voice-activated recorder in Laura's car. Over the next few days, they gathered some shocking information. Meanwhile, Jack managed to survive the critical 48-hour window and slowly began to recover. Amy, unaware of how close their father had come to death, visited the hospital briefly. The CDC eventually traced the source of Jack's infection to a medical lab in Brazil, where safety protocols had been ignored. Jack's employer promised to keep him on full pay during his recovery and even hinted at a potential settlement for the ordeal. The doctors warned, though, that Jack would need several more weeks in the hospital, followed by an extended period of recovery at home. Throughout it all, Jack couldn't help but notice that Laura rarely visited him. It cut deep, especially considering how much he had sacrificed for her over the years. A week later, when Tom returned from his trip, Adam, with Diane's permission, told him everything. Tom agreed that Diane should take the lead in confronting Laura, but he and Adam would be there to offer support and advice when needed. Eric's surveillance revealed disturbing details, including the fact that Jack's initial tests had shown traces of syphilis. While later tests came back negative, most likely due to the antibiotics, this was a huge red flag. A doctor approached Laura about the discovery, and she reluctantly agreed to get tested. The results were damning. Laura had an advanced infection, and the doctor advised that her partners, plural, would need to be tested as well. Ellen, one of Laura's close friends, pulled some strings to keep the test results confidential in exchange for financial help to cover the nurses' bills. When Diane found out about this, she was livid. She, along with her close friends, confronted Laura about her multiple affairs. Furious, Diane told her mother that she was taking Amy to stay with their Aunt Claire and demanded that Laura and her friends meet the next day to discuss everything. If they didn't cooperate, Diane threatened to hire a lawyer for Jack and go to the sheriff with all the evidence of bribery and infidelity. Shaken, Laura agreed to the meeting. Diane also called Susan, who had apparently tried to stop the whole situation from getting this bad, but Laura had ignored her. Susan agreed to attend the meeting, fully aware of the chaos that was about to unfold. The following day, Diane, Tom, and Adam gathered in the dining room to confront Laura, along with Ellen and Julia. Eric, feeling emotionally overwhelmed, had chosen to stay away. Diane stood at the head of the table with Tom and Adam flanking her, her face set in determination. "This is what we know," Diane began, her voice steady and controlled. "We have proofs. And if you deny it, we'll go to the sheriff and get a lawyer for Daddy." Her gaze shifted to Ellen and Julia, her eyes cold. You two convinced yourselves that you saw Daddy with another woman at the Hilton. You took terrible, grainy photos and manipulated Mother into believing he was cheating. She then turned to Laura, her voice hardening with anger. Instead of talking to Daddy, you let them push you into having your own affairs. Susan tried to stop you, but you ignored her. Laura sat there, visibly shaken, her eyes wide with shock. Diane pressed on, keeping her composure. You've ignored your family for so long that you let Ellen and Julia manipulate you. Don't even try to deny it. We found the hidden copy of Mr. Henderson's report. The photos and video of that man who only looks like Daddy. There's no way anyone could have believed that was him, unless they faked more evidence to convince you. If we need to, we'll prove it in court. Diane's tone grew darker as she shifted her focus back to Ellen and Julia. You two acted like pimps, finding her not just one lover, but four. She did things for them she never did for Daddy. While Daddy was away in Japan and Korea for work, she was going on dates. And when he was in Brazil, she slept with Ellen's brother and gave Daddy syphilis. Diane's glare burned into her mother. You wore the lingerie for him, didn't you, Mother? The same lingerie you never wore for Daddy. Her voice was full of disgust. We still don't know if you've passed HIV to him. Adam and Tom exchanged nervous glances, clearly unsettled by the intensity of Diane's accusations. Meanwhile, Laura crumbled, collapsing onto the dining table in tears. Susan, Ellen, and Julia looked absolutely terrified. But Diane didn't let up, her voice now dripping with contempt. You hired a detective to dig up dirt on Daddy, planning to confront and humiliate him. Well, now I control this. You will do what I say, or there will be jail time and lawsuits. She turned her cold gaze on Ellen and Julia again. You'll be back tomorrow at 2. Get out. Humiliated, Ellen and Julia quietly shuffled out of the house. The tension in the room was palpable. Adam moved to help Laura upstairs, while Tom carried a box of family memories behind them. Laura curled up on the bed, completely defeated. Diane followed them into the room and knelt beside her mother, her voice soft but firm. You need to decide if you want to stay married to Daddy and remain part of this family. If you do, I'll help you. But if you want to leave, I'll still love you. But the decision is yours. Diane opened the box, pulling out old family photos and videos. These are the memories you've forgotten. You're not in many of them because you were too busy with your friends. Laura stared at the pictures in stunned silence, her face pale. I still love you, Diane said, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. I'm furious, but I love you. If you decide to leave, I'll still love you, but it's your choice. Diane stood up, her eyes full of unspoken pain. She turned to Susan, who had been quietly standing by, and asked her to stay with Laura. Then, without another word, she walked out of the room, leaving her mother to face the weight of her decisions. I'll be back tomorrow at noon for your answer, Diane said, kissing her mother on the forehead before leaving. Laura remained curled up on the bed, quietly sobbing as Susan sat beside her, watching. How did I let this happen? She thought to herself. She had sensed things were wrong for some time but hadn't pushed hard enough to stop them. Ellen and Julia had been manipulative, but Laura knew she used to be smarter than this. Now, it was up to her to fix the damage she had caused. That night, Susan stayed with Laura, comforting her through the pain and helping her process the enormity of what had happened. They talked late into the night, about the past, Jack's illness, and how Laura might begin to repair the damage. By morning, something had shifted in Laura. There was a new resolve in her, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She spent the early hours playing old family tapes and sorting through photo albums, recognizing, for the first time in a long while, just how much she had taken for granted. The simple, precious moments of family life that she had once cherished now seemed distant and almost forgotten. 6 years ago, she had grown bored with her life, restless with routine, and got caught up in the toxic gossip swirling around her friends. Ellen's lies and manipulations had only fed her growing discontent. And now, looking back at it all, Laura realized just how lonely and bitter she had become. "I'm like Scrooge," she thought, wondering if there was still time for her to redeem herself. The next day, Diane returned to find her mother transformed. Laura was up, washed, dressed, and determined. Surprised by the change, Diane asked, "Do you have anything to say?" Laura, holding back tears, confessed, "What I did to your father, to this family, it's awful. I've been living in a fantasy, ignoring the damage I caused. I'm so sorry it took this to wake me up. Please, give me another chance. I know I'll make mistakes, but I'll keep trying. Just, don't leave me." Diane's expression softened. "We won't throw you away. We love you. But do you want to stay married to Daddy?" Laura, her voice breaking, admitted, "I still love Jack, but how could he forgive me? I cheated on him 6 times and gave him an STD, maybe even HIV. How could he ever stay with me?" Diane reassured her, explaining that Tom had made sure that all but one of Laura's lovers had tested negative for both syphilis and HIV. There was hope that Laura hadn't contracted anything worse. "We've agreed not to tell Daddy about the affairs unless he asks directly. It's up to you now, Mom. Make him feel loved, so he never has to ask. Spend more time with him at the hospital. He's hurting because you've been avoiding him." Laura nodded, absorbing the reality of what her daughter was saying. "Why did you believe Daddy was cheating in the first place?" "Those photos were terrible," Diane asked, a touch of exasperation in her voice. Susan chimed in, explaining, "It was Julia. She convinced us that Jack was staying at the Hilton and cheating. We never even read the full detective's report." Diane, frustrated, revealed the truth. "That man you thought was Daddy? He's someone else. He moved to the area with his fiancée." Julia lied. Susan, now visibly furious, added, "We should have questioned her. She just wanted to stir up drama." Laura, overwhelmed with guilt, whispered, "I should have trusted your father." Diane's voice turned cold. "Don't worry. I'll deal with Ellen and Julia. They hurt this family, and I'm going to make them pay." Laura, alarmed, pleaded, "Please, Diane, don't. Just let it go." But Diane was resolute. "There's no discussion. They're going to pay." With that, Diane outlined her conditions for Laura's redemption. "You need therapy, which Uncle Tom will cover. You'll also spend more time with Daddy, and I expect you to be honest with yourself about everything that happened. This won't be easy, but it's the only way forward." Laura nodded, humbled and grateful, knowing this was her last chance to put things right. "You're going to cut all ties with Ellen and Julia unless one of us is there," Diane ordered, her voice sharp as a knife. "You'll also support Daddy in everything, whether it's moving like he's been wanting to or even changing jobs if that's what he needs." Laura, looking pale, stammered, I haven't really been contributing much financially. Most of my income went to clothes and other things. I do have a secret savings account, but it's barely anything." Diane stared at her, eyes blazing. "You're kidding me, right? You don't even own that many clothes." Laura let out a short, bitter laugh. "Oh, but you've never really noticed, have you? I've been dressing like one of those women on TV for years now. That purse, $1,500. The cheapest pantsuit I have, $800. None of my shoes cost less than $300. Diane crossed her arms, unimpressed. "And you thought that was more important than your family?" Laura's face flushed with shame as she continued. "I wanted to feel important, like I belonged with those high society women. And the spa treatments, too, sometimes 3 times a month, $500 a visit. I loved how they treated me like a queen. Diane's expression hardened. Mother, you've been living in a dream while the rest of us were scraping by. Uncle Tom and I looked into the family finances. We're sinking. We were hoping you had some sort of hidden fortune, but you only have about $10,000. That's nothing, barely a drop in the ocean for what we need. Tears welled in Laura's eyes. I'm sorry. I've failed all of you. We'll figure something out, Diane said, her voice softening slightly. I'll talk to Uncle Tom and Uncle Adam. They love Daddy, they'll help. But I need you to answer me honestly. Do you agree to everything we've asked? Laura nodded desperately. Yes, I'll do whatever you ask. Do you really think Tom and Adam will help us? Diane gave a short laugh. They will. And if they won't, I'll stop playing poker with them until they do. The joke seemed to ease the tension for a brief moment, and Laura managed a weak smile. Suddenly, Diane's face turned serious again. Hold on, she said, leaving the room for a moment and coming back with a shopping bag. There's one more condition. Laura stiffened, unsure of what was coming next. You did things for those men, Diane began, her voice dripping with disgust, things you never did for Daddy. You wore lingerie for them, lingerie that he bought. You're going to burn all of it. And then you'll go and buy new things. For him, not for anyone else. Laura was speechless as Diane continued, her words like hammer blows. You're done with the spas. You'll start working out and becoming the woman Daddy deserves. I even bought you some books on how to make your husband feel like a king. She tossed a few titles onto the table. You'll read them, memorize them, and put them into practice. Every day, you'll make him feel like he's the man you want to be with. If you have to fake it, fine, be the best actress you can be. Because if you don't, I'll make sure Daddy divorces you and finds someone who will. Laura sat there, stunned into silence. She realized Diane was serious, dead serious. After a long pause, she nodded. You're right. I'll do it. Whatever it takes. Diane smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile Laura was used to. Good. Now, get ready. Tom and Adam will be here at 2. At exactly 2 o'clock, Ellen and Julia arrived, both looking as if they were walking into an execution. Diane stood before them, her eyes cold, her stance commanding. Here's how this is going to go, she said, her voice slicing through the silence. I've got rules, and I've got questions. If you lie to me, or you try to play games, I'll go straight to the sheriff. And we will sue you for everything you have. Do you understand? Both women nodded, clearly terrified. We already know Julia lied about following my father from the airport, Diane continued, her tone icy. And I'm not going to ask if you were in on it, Ellen. I don't care about that. But here's what I do care about, who are the other 3 men, and how do we find them? Ellen hesitated, visibly squirming. After a tense moment, she finally confessed. I found 2 of them, and Julia found 2 as well. My second one was Tom Williams. He's an X-ray tech at the hospital. Is he married? Diane's voice was hard, unyielding. No, Ellen said, looking down. Good, Diane replied coldly. We'll deal with him. Julia, what about your 2 men? Diane's voice cut through the room as she stepped behind her chair, her tone icy and unforgiving. Julia hesitated, her face paling under Diane's steely gaze. Diane had no patience for games. She grabbed a fistful of Julia's hair, slamming her forehead onto the table with a jarring thud. Julia gasped as Diane twisted her into a chokehold, cutting off her air. Okay. Julia choked out, her voice trembling. One is a delivery guy named Ted. I don't know his last name. The other is Jack, a guy I met online. I have his address. Diane released Julia, who slumped to the floor, gasping for breath. Good, Diane said coldly, her face an unyielding mask. Turning to Ellen, she demanded, "Where did all this happen?" Ellen, looking defeated, admitted, "Once at a hotel, twice at Julia's place, and 3 times at my house." Diane's eyes narrowed. Who else knows about these affairs? Ellen's voice was barely a whisper. I told my sister and a coworker. Julia, still recovering from the chokehold, added, I've gossiped to several people. Diane's eyes flared with anger. You both will go back and clear my mother's name. If you don't, my father will find out, and I will come after you. Understood? Both women nodded vigorously, their faces pale with fear. Cut ties with my mother and Susan unless I specifically say otherwise, Diane continued, her voice like ice. In 2 weeks, you'll face me again. I'm going to make you pay for everything you've done. Ellen and Julia scrambled to their feet, their faces etched with fear, and fled from the room. Exhausted, Diane collapsed into a chair. Acting tough is draining, she muttered, her voice betraying her fatigue. Tom brought her a glass of water as Laura and Susan entered the room. Are they gone? Susan asked, her voice trembling. Yep, Tom said with a smirk. Diane scared them off after threatening them with a fight. Laura's eyes widened in alarm. You can't actually do that, Diane. Diane gave her a reassuring smile. Don't worry, Mama. I've had years of self-defense training. They might get hurt, but I won't. Tom then filled Laura in. We have leads on the other men. Adam and I will take care of it. Diane expressed concern for Tom's reputation, but he assured her with a chuckle. They knew you were married, Laura. They need to face consequences. Laura shook her head, surprising everyone. No, I need to deal with them myself. I've hurt Jack, and I need to face the consequences. They need to learn not to mess with a married woman. Tom nodded in agreement. We'll make plans later. For now, let's relax. Laura agreed, saying, I need to visit Jack at the hospital. She turned to Diane, adding, I know I've lost some of your respect, but I'm working to earn it back. Diane's face softened into a smile. You're starting to, and you never lost my love. With a playful wink, she added, I'll stay home and catch up on homework. Maybe I'll even get Uncle Tom to do it for me. Tom and Adam chuckled, and everyone exchanged hugs. Laura apologized repeatedly before she and Susan left for the hospital. Diane headed upstairs to rest while Tom and Adam remained downstairs. Adam went grocery shopping and returned to prepare Grandma Lily's famous chicken and dumplings, cornbread, and pecan pie. Later, Amy came back from the mall, and Tom gave Eric a brief rundown of the situation, sensing his son's attempts to avoid thinking about it. After Adam's delicious dinner, Tom helped Diane with her homework. They all gathered for a family tradition, playing PE Knuckle. During the game, Diane shared that her mother had spent most of her money on expensive clothes, leaving only around $10,000, far short of what they needed for Jack's move or a new car. Tom, glancing at his cards, said calmly, Diane, I have more money than I could ever spend. Your dad knows that, but his pride makes it hard for him to ask. He feels like he's failed financially, and that's eating him up. We need to help him without bruising his pride. Adam agreed, suggesting, let's add $30,000 to Laura's savings. We'll tell Jack it's money we set aside for emergencies and college expenses. Tom nodded. That's a good idea. We need to keep his dignity intact. Diane, her voice trembling with emotion, apologized. I'm so sorry for needing your help. I never wanted to be a burden. Tom reached over and gave her a reassuring smile. Your family. I'd give $1 million if needed. The only issue is his pride. Diane's eyes welled up with tears. I love you, Uncle Tom. I love you too, Diane, Tom said warmly. Adam lightened the mood by suggesting they buy a partially completed house near Aunt Claire's and finish it themselves. Tom protested about painting, but they agreed to hire out the more difficult tasks. The conversation then shifted to planning for Jack's recovery, including a new car and how to support him once he was home. At the hospital, Laura and Susan arrived with magazines and books for Jack. Laura's nerves were on edge, hoping Jack would be asleep when she arrived, so he'd wake to find her by his side. As they approached the room, they heard Jack talking to his boss, Brian Wilkins. Don't worry about work, Brian said reassuringly. We've got you covered: workers' comp, full pay, bonuses, and your medical bills. Take all the time you need to recover. Jack thanked him, and Brian left the room. Laura took Susan aside until Brian was out of sight. Once clear, Laura took a deep breath and entered Jack's room. He lay there, looking pale and thinner than she remembered. Seeing him so vulnerable filled her with a crushing guilt. She sat by his side, gently taking his hand. I won't leave you again, Jack. I'll make this right, she vowed. Susan quietly sat nearby, flipping through a magazine. Jack, half awake, felt the light touch and assumed it was one of his daughters. When he opened his eyes, he was surprised to see Laura. Hey, babe, he said softly, a faint smile on his face. Hey, Jack, Laura whispered, her heart aching. How are you? Jack, surprised by her affection, replied, I'm doing okay. Still weak, but the infection is clearing up. I need physical therapy and more antibiotics, but I'm on track. I'm so glad, Laura said, trying to keep her voice upbeat. I've been so worried about you. Jack's smile faded as he asked, where have you been? I've barely seen you. I don't want to make you feel bad, but do you even love me anymore? Laura's voice trembled. Oh, Jack, I do love you. I'm so sorry I haven't been here. I've been a wreck, but I'm going to be here for you from now on. Please give me a chance. Jack sighed. Okay, but remember, we're the parents. We don't have the luxury of falling apart. You need to stay strong for the kids. Tom and Adam are always willing to help, but we need to give 100% to our family. Laura's guilt deepened, knowing he didn't understand the full extent of her betrayal. She forced herself to stay calm. You're right. I need to do better. Jack smiled weakly. I've missed you. I'm glad you're here now. I'm glad too, Laura replied, barely holding it together. I promise I'll do better, Laura vowed, trying to keep her voice steady. Their conversation shifted to practical matters: bills, the kids, and Jack's work. Jack mentioned that Tom had been managing their finances and that his pay, along with any compensation for his illness, would now go directly into their account. Feeling the weight of her actions, Laura confessed, Jack, I've managed to save some money, about $40,000. I should have contributed more, but from now on, 2/3 of my salary will go into our household account. Jack, always trusting, smiled weakly. That's wonderful, Laura. I appreciate it more than you know. I love you. Laura's heart ached with guilt. She didn't deserve his trust or affection. Struggling to maintain her composure, she replied, I'm just doing what I should have been doing all along. As the exhaustion from their conversation overcame him, Jack drifted back to sleep. Laura remained by his side, holding his hand, her heart heavy with remorse. Susan, who had overheard their discussion, felt a pang of sympathy for Jack. He had always been the family's rock, protecting them and providing for them. Now, here he was, vulnerable and unaware of the full extent of Laura's betrayal. Susan couldn't help but think that perhaps Jack needed therapy as much as Laura did. When Jack woke briefly, their conversation turned to small, everyday matters. They included Susan in their chat, but Jack soon grew tired and asked them to leave before he fell asleep again. Despite her desire to stay, Laura had to prepare for work the next day to meet her new financial responsibilities. She promised to return the following evening. By the following Monday, Tom's investigator had gathered information on Laura's 4 lovers. By Tuesday, 3 of them, excluding Danny, had been warned about Laura's STD and urged to get tested. They complied and agreed to share their results. Tom, Adam, and Diane decided to wait until all the results were in before taking any further action, planning to deal with Danny last. When the results came in, it was revealed that only Danny had contracted an STD. With this information, the family was ready to proceed with their plans. During this time, Laura began seeing a new therapist, Dr. Michelle Ward, a respected psychiatrist and author whom Tom had met through social circles. In their sessions, Laura recounted her story. Dr. Ward, though professional, did not hold back in her assessment. She pointed out how Laura's behavior had been selfish and immature, keeping her finances separate, spending extravagantly on herself, and failing to recognize Jack's sacrifices. Worst of all, Laura had believed false accusations about Jack and cheated on him with multiple men. Dr. Ward, recognizing Laura's tendency to deflect blame, confronted her with the full gravity of her mistakes. She found it hard to believe Jack had tolerated so much, questioning if he had been overly lenient over the years. In the afternoons, Diane drove herself and her siblings to visit their father at the hospital. Evenings were spent either training at the dojo or working out at home. By Friday, the day before Diane's planned confrontation with Julia, Jack was ready to return home. They had arranged a hospital bed in the master bedroom, keeping space for their king-sized bed. Laura, Tom, and Adam went to pick up Jack from the hospital, while the kids stayed home, eagerly preparing a banner to welcome him. When Jack arrived, he was visibly exhausted. He used a walker to make his way slowly into the house, struggling with each step as he climbed the stairs. Fatigue took its toll, and halfway up, he collapsed into a sitting position, reassuring his worried family that he just needed a moment to rest. Seeing his struggle, Tom and Adam quickly decided to help, lifting him the rest of the way. They carefully settled him into the hospital bed placed next to the king-sized bed, where Laura insisted on staying close. Jack fell asleep almost immediately, and Laura lay beside him, her arm draped protectively over him. After an hour, Amy, unable to find her mother downstairs, peeked into the room and saw her parents asleep together. Comforted by the sight, Amy felt reassured that everything would improve. On Saturday, the day of the fight, Julia met Diane at an abandoned factory, a location Adam had prepared by covering the floor with foam and tarps. Ellen had driven Julia, who had been training diligently, even taking self-defense classes, much to her husband's bemusement. Despite her efforts, Julia was woefully unprepared for a real confrontation. Diane, dressed in sportswear, had a strategy to tire Julia out before delivering any serious blows. She started with light slaps and punches. Within just 20 minutes, Julia was a sobbing mess, pleading for mercy. The spectators, including Laura, were taken aback. Even Laura thought it was time to call a halt, but Diane, disappointed by how easily Julia was breaking down, felt it was necessary to make the moment unforgettable. Diane contemplated a harsh final move but realized it would damage the tarp and cause trouble for Adam. Instead, she grabbed Julia by the hair and dragged her toward the front office. Julia screamed in pain, and Diane instructed her to crawl or walk if it hurt too much. "Don't worry, the fight's over. We'll be back in 5 minutes," Diane told the others. In a grimy bathroom, Diane threw Julia onto the floor, delivering a few harsh blows and spitting on her. "You're getting off easy. Don't ever cross me again," she warned before returning to the others. "Time to head home." "Ellen, your turn is tomorrow," Diane said as she, Adam, and Tom prepared to leave. Adam and Tom joked as they departed, but Diane was less amused. "I trained for 2 weeks for that fight. Amy could have done it with one hand. I know Ellen is in worse shape, Diane said. Laura, cautious, reminded Diane, don't get too confident. Ellen used to be athletic. The next day, Ellen did put up more of a fight, lasting 40 minutes before collapsing from exhaustion. Diane inflicted some bruises, but fewer than she had hoped. Ellen, apologizing, told Laura she hoped things would work out with Jack. With Ellen dealt with, it was time to confront Laura's four lovers. Tom and Adam, transformed with makeup and padding into intimidating figures, Adam as a thug and Tom as a Japanese yakuza, prepared for the next phase of their plan. Laura, playing herself, carried a taser just in case. Their strategy involved confronting the men near dumpsters, intimidating them, and then tossing them inside with zip ties on the lid, allowing them to escape but delaying their departure. Danny was saved for last. As he was throwing out his trash, tired from work, Laura and her team approached him. With a menacing tone, she asked, "Remember me, Danny?" Danny exhaled deeply, recognizing the gravity of the situation. "I'm sorry about the syphilis, Laura. I've tested negative for HIV so far and hope it stays that way." His calmness caught Laura off guard, fueling her anger further. "You helped me betray my husband," Laura snapped, her voice laced with bitterness. "You knew Jack wasn't cheating. You should have known better." Danny's face remained composed. "I shouldn't have been involved." "I'm sorry," he said evenly, but his calm response only fueled Laura's frustration. Pointing to Tom, Laura said, "He's a friend from Japan here to settle a debt. You need to keep quiet and get out of the state within a week." Danny raised an eyebrow, his expression unfazed. "Is this some kind of joke?" Furious, Laura pulled out the taser and shot Danny in the groin. The sudden jolt of pain caused Danny to collapse, writhing on the ground. Adam and Tom were stunned. This was not part of the plan. Danny managed to pull the darts out and, though in pain, quickly regained his composure. "Are you out of your minds?" Danny roared, glaring at Tom and Adam. "I know exactly who you are and what you're up to. Tom and Adam, with your pathetic disguises. I have cameras set up around here. I could report you in a heartbeat." Laura, Tom, and Adam stood paralyzed, realizing their plan was unraveling. Danny, his anger boiling over, revealed he had syphilis from his ex-fiancée and blamed her for the infection. He knew Jack wasn't cheating and had planned to expose Laura's affair, but Jack's illness had put a hold on that. Danny had photos of Laura and could reveal them at any moment but agreed to keep quiet as long as she stayed faithful. He chastised Laura for her hypocrisy and how she had once desperately sought their encounters. With that, he stormed off, shoving past Adam and Tom. Devastated, Laura sank to the ground, overwhelmed by the collapse of her plan. As Danny walked away, she vowed to recommit to Jack and her family. Tom and Adam exchanged worried looks, doubting their decision to support her. Jack's recovery was slow, but he eventually returned to part-time work 2 months after his illness. Laura, now more affectionate, explained they couldn't be physically intimate for at least another month due to her ongoing infection. Adam found a great deal on a partially built house near Penny's area. With hired help for the major tasks and the family handling the rest, the new home would be more affordable than their current one. Laura suggested it would be nice to live closer to her sister and that she might be able to transfer to a different job. Jack considered fixing up his old minivan, but Tom recommended getting a newer model. They ended up finding a nearly new minivan with a full warranty at a great price. 3 months after Jack's hospitalization, Laura's infection was under control. Danny and his ex had both tested negative for HIV. One evening, Laura, now fitter from her workouts, surprised Jack with a passionate kiss, marking their emotional and physical reconnection. Jack returned to full-time work in a new sales department. His talent for closing deals and solving problems had not gone unnoticed, and his absence during his illness had led to a dip in sales and customer satisfaction. To retain Jack, the company offered him a 50% raise, pushing his income into six figures for the first time. Despite his aversion to travel, the impressive salary and company support motivated him to stay. That spring, Laura befriended Sally, a BMW sales manager who saw potential in Laura's charm and style. Sally offered Laura a part-time sales position, believing that Laura's appeal would resonate particularly well with female customers. Excited by the opportunity, Laura discussed it with Jack and Diane, both of whom supported her decision. Laura thrived in her new role, forging strong connections with customers through her passion for fashion and sociability. She quickly transitioned from part-time to full-time work, nearly doubling her income by summer. She was enjoying her new career and managing to balance it with family life seamlessly. Their new home was finished by summer. Whenever Jack returned from a sales trip, he would find Tom, Adam, Diane, and Eric pretending to be exhausted while the actual construction workers quickly packed up and left. Although they almost got caught a few times, Jack grew increasingly suspicious but never had concrete evidence of the ruse. Tom had even struck a deal with the suppliers, billing Jack for only 60% to 80% of the actual costs and covering the rest himself. What should have cost Jack and Laura over $25,000 for the kitchen ended up costing just $16,000. Tom wanted to help out his brother and family, and Jack was thrilled with the results. He enjoyed his country life, his higher earnings, and having his loving wife back. 6 months after starting therapy, Laura decided to quit. She felt she had gained enough self-awareness and, juggling 2 jobs, she didn't have the time for more. Dr. Ward's tough approach and subtle critiques had also started to wear on her. She decided to step away, thinking, "No one's perfect, relax." Instead of attending a 4-year university, Diane opted for the local college for her first 2 years, just as her dad and Uncle Tom had done. She had some doubts and wanted to stay close to home. Laura and Jack began going out on weekly romantic dates, rediscovering their connection. Laura was reminded of what a wonderful dancer Jack was. It was the middle of the second summer after Jack's illness, and the kids were away at a water park for a few days, a trip Laura had planned. Jack felt content as he entered the house, anticipating some quiet, intimate time with Laura. However, instead of finding her waiting in a negligee, he saw her sitting formally at the dining room table with a small stack of papers in front of her. "Jack, I'm sorry, but we need to talk," Laura said softly, gesturing for him to sit beside her. A sinking feeling formed in Jack's stomach. "Jack, I love you, but not in the way a wife should love her husband. I care about you deeply as family, as the father of our children, but I need more. I need something beyond the role of wife and mother. I'm truly sorry, Jack." "I've tried," Laura said, her voice breaking as she struggled to hold back tears. Jack sat there, stunned, his eyes fixed on her with a mixture of disbelief and confusion. He felt as if you were looking at a stranger. Laura's eyes, glistening with unshed tears, seemed to expect him to reach out and comfort her, but he remained motionless. "Laura, we've been getting along so well. This can't be real. Are you serious?" Jack's voice was choked with emotion. "I'm sorry, Jack," Laura said, her hand trembling as she pushed the stack of papers towards him. "These are the divorce papers. I'm asking for very little. You've already done so much, and I think it's best if we share custody of the kids. I've already put a deposit on a condo." She had already bought and furnished a condo from one of her clients. "This is incredibly hard for me, Jack. Please try to understand. I've moved my things out. I need to go now." "This is too overwhelming," she said, standing up, tears streaming down her face. She left the house, sobbing uncontrollably once she was in the car. But as she started the engine, she took a deep breath and the tears stopped. A sense of relief washed over her. This is the right decision, she thought. Maybe things will work out eventually, but I need this for myself. As she drove away, Jack remained at the table, staring blankly at the divorce papers. "What just happened?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The following day, Diane, Eric, and Amy returned home. Uncle Adam was waiting for them on the porch. "Before you go inside, I need to talk to you," Adam said, his face serious. Diane, anxious, brushed past him and rushed inside. She found her father on the couch, looking utterly devastated. Uncle Tom stood nearby, his face reflecting concern and sympathy. "That witch," Diane muttered under her breath, running to her parents' bedroom. She opened the closet and saw that all of Laura's clothes were gone. "That witch," she screamed, her voice echoing through the house. 2 years had passed since Laura left. Initially, things were difficult, but Diane had come to believe it was for the best. She had re-established a solid relationship with the kids and even saw Jack during holidays, though he hadn't extended an invitation for Thanksgiving yet. As November approached, she wondered why. Laura had arranged to meet Diane at an upscale restaurant and dance venue, an unexpected choice for a mother-daughter meeting. Diane had joked about finding some men together, and they were shown to a small, private booth in the back, perfect for their conversation. "Mom," Diane began, her tone calm but resolute, "you have no idea how devastated Dad was when you left. He was a wreck for weeks and had to take time off work. For 2 months, he couldn't even bring himself to see you. Uncle Tom and Uncle Adam practically moved in with us to help. You completely blindsided him. I should have warned him. I knew you were planning something, but to do it so suddenly, while he was alone, was just cruel. I'm sorry, Diane. I didn't know how else to do it. It's not like I took everything from him. I only took my share of the retirement savings," Laura said, her words sounding empty even to her. She had taken very little because she knew Jack would look after the kids, and her pride wouldn't let her take more. Most of their savings, college funds, and retirement accounts were the fruits of Jack's relentless hard work. Deep down, Laura had always harbored the hope of returning home one day, keeping the door open in her mind. Diane abruptly broke her thoughts. "Look at the bar, Mom. See those men waiting for drinks?" Laura glanced over and her heart skipped a beat. There, among the crowd, was a well-dressed man who seemed particularly distinct. "Is that Jack?" she asked, her voice trembling with shock. "Yes, it is," Diane confirmed sharply. "You took Dad for granted. You never saw him as desirable, but others did. You conditioned yourself to overlook his appeal, always thinking the grass was greener elsewhere." Laura watched in stunned silence as Jack moved confidently through the room, more polished and self-assured than she remembered. Women noticed him, and Laura felt a pang of desire she hadn't experienced in years. "Doesn't he look good?" she murmured, almost to herself. Diane's voice was cold. "You hurt him, and now you see what you lost." Laura suddenly realized she had underestimated Jack's qualities, having been distracted by fantasies of other men. Seeing him like this, she longed to reconnect. She thought about asking him to dance, hoping to rekindle their old bond. But Diane intervened. "You'll never have him again. He's moved on." Laura's heart sank as she watched Jack return to his table, where a younger woman stood to greet him. It was Michelle Ward, her former therapist. Laura could hardly believe her eyes. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. Diane smirked. "It's been tough keeping it a secret. Michelle, or Shelley as she's known now, became interested in Dad after your therapy sessions. She wouldn't have pursued him back then, but after the separation, I made sure they met." Laura watched in shock as Michelle kissed Jack, his hand resting on her pregnant belly. "They got married in May," Diane revealed, pulling out an invitation Laura had declined. "Didn't you get this?" Laura's mind was racing. "I have it right here," Diane continued. "Now, I'm going to be a big sister. Amy's thrilled and even going to be in the delivery room. I love you, Mom, Diane said, her tone softening slightly. But I had to make things right for Dad. You cheated, took him for granted, and left us all behind. But I still love you. Laura barely heard Diane's words, her thoughts consumed by the realization of what she had lost. The life she had chosen now felt hollow, and she could only imagine a future of loneliness. Diane gently took her hand. Mama, we love you. You won't be alone.